You're listening to Nutrition Matters podcast with Paige Smathers, registered dietitian nutritionist. Nutrition Matters podcast explores how to approach food and your body in a whole new way. I interview people who share stories and expertise in rejecting diet culture, making peace with food, and discovering a more positive, realistic, and sustainable approach to health and well-being. I'm Paige Smathers, registered dietitian nutritionist, and owner of Positive Nutrition, an in-person nutrition therapy practice in Salt Lake City, Utah. I offer free resources, including this podcast, a blog, and posts on social media. If you're local to Salt Lake City, check out our services and availability for appointments, and keep your eyes out for in-person groups on mindfulness, intuitive eating, body image resilience, and more. Go to positive-nutrition.com and hit subscribe if you'd like to keep in touch. I also offer online courses covering topics like the science of nutrition, mindfulness, and healing your relationship with food. Check those out at positive-nutrition.com/academy. If you like what you hear on the podcast, you can make a difference by leaving a review, sharing with friends and family, or making a donation. Thank you so much for your support. You can also find me on Instagram or Facebook if you'd like to have a little more food for thought at Paige Smathers RD. Thank you so much for listening. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Nutrition Matters podcast. My name is Paige, and as always, I'm so thrilled to connect with you and so grateful for you being here. Today, I am interviewing Isabel Foxen Duke, who is just such a brilliant voice in the recovery community and the non-diet space. Isabel is really gifted with words and with her way of explaining things and with her passion and excitement for this stuff. I'm just really always impressed with her work. And today I'm sharing a conversation we had basically about her story, where she struggled with dieting and binging, and then the diet binge cycle continued on. And really, she shares today all about how she was finally able to stop fighting food, and kind of her journey from chronically dieting to kind of chronically looking for answers in the recovery space. I think is a really interesting look. And I think no matter who you are and where you come from and where you are in your own process with this stuff, I really think that what she has to say will resonate with you. So thanks so much for joining me. Thanks for being here. There really is not any housekeeping I want to do today other than just expressing a little gratitude. It's the month of November. We are kind of, at least in the US, getting into the space where we're starting to think about Thanksgiving, and that always brings up lots of conversations about gratitude. And I'm grateful for this platform. I'm grateful for each of you. I'm grateful for your virtual and real hugs you give me. It's always nice to just know and remember that there are lots of you out there listening to this. And so I'm just sincerely grateful for this opportunity. Okay, and with that, I will let Isabel introduce herself a bit, and she just kind of takes it away and does a lot of really good job of talking about her story. So enjoy. Hi, Isabel. Welcome to Nutrition Matters podcast, and thanks so much for joining me.
Hi, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yay. I've followed your work for a long time, and I've heard you on other podcasts, and I've always been so impressed with your approach and your just way with words and way with explaining things, and I'm really excited to dive into this topic today. So yeah, thanks again.
My pleasure. Let's do it.
Okay. So Isabel, many of my listeners will sort of be people who are very familiar with this sort of non-diet recovery space. And so they might have already heard a bit about you in the past or on other podcasts, but just in case they haven't, explain who you are and what you do and why you do it, and maybe share a little bit about your story, whatever's relevant.
Yeah. So, again, my name is Isabel Foxen Duke, and my tagline, right, like how I sort of describe my elevator pitch is I help women stop feeling crazy around food, right? I remember I kind of came up with that, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 years ago. And the reason that I described the work that I do that way was because I was noticing at that time, right, there were so many folks. It seemed like there were like people who really resonated with this concept of eating disorder recovery. And then there seemed to be like everyone else who didn't even necessarily identify with the, sort of title of eating disorder or disordered eating, or would never even thought that way, but just were folks who were like, I can't stop thinking about food. I'm obsessed about my weight. Like I feel out of control around food all the time. I feel like I'm constantly trying to like get my food under control, but then I end up having these sort of like wild episodes where I just can't stop eating everything that isn't nailed down. Like all of these thoughts that, I think people in the clinical world would just say is various spectrums of disordered eating. But I think the vast majority of people who are dealing with that don't necessarily identify with that clinical term. And so I sort of, I kind of saw this, right? Like I kind of saw the 95% of what I would say are people on the sort of disordered eating spectrum, really didn't identify with that term at all, right? Like they were just like, there's something wrong with me. My relationship with food is weird. Like I have food issues, right? You hear that one a lot. I have food issues. But they would never have put themselves in sort of like the clinical category of eating disorder or even use the term disordered eating. And this was a while ago. So, something also like I started doing this work online publicly, 10 years ago. And so there was nothing, there was not very much public information online. Health at every size was definitely not a concept that you were hearing about on the internet. Intuitive eating, yes, you were hearing about it, but you were hearing about it in the context of like dieting and weight loss, right? Like this is the new answer to permanent thinness, right? So it was like a really weird, it was kind of a different time on the internet. There wasn't, the intuitive eating, sort of movement as we see it in the non-diet eating disorder recovery world didn't really exist the way it exists now online at that time. So sort of like there were new ideas. And I feel like, anyway, that's sort of how I kind of generally introduce myself. As it's so funny to even be asked that question, like, what do you do? I'm like, oh, I'm going to share my tagline. But it's just interesting thinking about like how that came about seems like a historical question at this point.
Yeah.
And so, I think also I sort of, the reason I that sort of line came to me when I first started my business is because that's how I felt. I did have a clinical eating disorder background. I was in, multiple different treatments for eating disorders, primarily of which I guess would now be identified as binge eating disorder. Although, quite frankly, I was all over the map, right? I don't even like the term binge eating disorder because I just feel like eating disorders are just usually it's like just different combinations of all of the behaviors, like I'm not a big fan of the big delineations between different types. It's more just like they present themselves differently for different folks at different times in people's lives.
True. And they have a tendency to morph and evolve.
They are more, totally. I think, for me, it started with like more restriction and then like bounced into binging. And then there was purging periods in my life and then more like just restriction. And then there was the appetite suppressant. There were just so many different, it just presents differently at different times for different folks in different ways. But it's kind of all, in my opinion, just different versions of the same core issues, right? And so, so for me, the way that I identified was just really like, I felt that way. Like I just felt crazy around food. Like that was how it felt. I was put on my first diet when I was really, really young. Anyone who's heard me on any other podcasts will know that about my story. I almost always start my story by sharing that I was put on my first diet when I was 3 years old by a pediatrician. A misguided, hopefully, I would like to think well-meaning, but misguided pediatrician when I was super young. So I have no memories of not being obsessed with food, pretty much. Or like, I have no memories of not feeling like food was this thing that I wanted that I shouldn't have. That was, my relationship with food from the very beginning, which I think really set me up for a lot of sort of destructive messages around food, even in treatment settings. So, I was a person who I was in and out of Overeaters Anonymous at several points in my, sort of binge eating recovery journey. And I identified as a food addict and all of these things because that narrative worked perfectly for a person like me who had no conscious memories of ever being, quote, normal around food, right? Because I was so young when I was put on my first diet, I I just thought that I was just born that way, right? Like I was just born obsessed with food, like born a bottomless pit, born a person who, if she didn't sit on her hands trying not to eat, would just eat everything that wasn't nailed down, right? Like I just thought that that was somehow in my genetics, right? Or something, right? And yeah, so my whole life I didn't really, you don't question the dieting, right? The trying to lose weight and the trying to be thin just felt like, well, of course, right? Like that's the normal course of action, of course. Like it didn't even question the dieting piece of it. I didn't question the trying to be thin piece of it. But I always thought, oh, my big problem is that I just can't stick, right? I can't get it under control. My appetites are too wild. I can't control myself around food. That I always identified with to some varying levels and varying degrees my entire life. So in retrospect, it's really easy for me to say, yeah, I was a chronic diet binge cycler from the age of 3 on. But I didn't even realize or consider myself to be a diet binge cycler for most of my life because the diet, it would never even occur to me to call myself a dieter because it's like, that's just the way life is. Like the way that life is you're supposed to just try to not eat too much so that you can have the right kind of body. In my mind, I just identified as maybe a binge eater. I mean, that language didn't even come to me until later on in, maybe like later in high school, like when I started, going to the Barnes and Noble. This was back in pre-internet days where you'd go to Barnes and Noble and you'd read the wellness books and you'd find the self-help section and you'd be like, oh, that's me. I'm a binge eater,
Yeah.
But up until then, my whole life, it was just, I was constantly just trying to lose weight and constantly failing at that in some way or another. Like maybe I'd succeed for a little while and then I'd fail, right? That was my entire existence up until college, basically. And then, yeah, I remember being in college. I mean, my story really started, that part is kind of the normal part of the story. Or I won't say normal, I'll say common, right? Like that existence, right. That way of living where it's just like, yeah, of course I'm trying to always be thinner and thinner and trying to eat less and trying to, of course. And then, often failing and feeling like badly about myself and just kind of going up and down and up and down. That was my part of my story that I think was really common, right? I think that so many people are dealing with. Once I got to college, I think is when things start to get a little bit more interesting. So I, at one point when I was in college, I got so desperate. I was just like, oh, you're spending your whole life. I just wanted to be thin, like the thin girls. Right. And interestingly enough, I was always like, kind of like past as normal weight. I was always a thin person as I now define it in my life. I was never a plus size person. But I was always just like a hair bigger than the thinnest girl, the thin girls who were like really popular and getting all the attention and whatever else I thought. For whatever reason, I just thought I was just always a little too big. I just always was too big. And I remember getting to college and just thinking, this is my last chance, right? This is such a like young person way to think about it. This is my last chance, right? It's my last schooling situation. It's my last chance to be like the most popular girl or something. It's like my last chance to like get all the attention from the boys. Like this is college. I've got to make this work. Like high school was a disappointment. Middle school was a disappointment. Like I've got to make it work in college. I've got to finally get down to whatever the weight is that I want to be in college. And I just became desperate and obsessed with just like achieving or attaining this like magic that I thought that thinness would bring me. And I started doing drugs. That was when I got so desperate for that I started using stimulants and appetite suppressants and all sorts of like illicit, illegal drugs, cocaine. I mean, anything I could get my hands on, because the only way I could sustain the level of thinness that I deemed acceptable was by taking speed. And very quickly I ended up in rehab, right? I mean, hand somebody with an eating disorder, addictive stimulant medications, they're probably going to end up in treatment. And that's what happened. I mean, I ended up in treatment within 6 months.
It's so scary that the desire for thinness is so strong that it overpowers like any type of
Safety.
hesitation. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
totally.
Like that's
Safety did
alarming.
not, it is very alarming. I mean, if you think about, I mean, anyone with a purging history, same shit, right? Excuse me, same thing.
You're fine.
Yeah. Like, so, and it's interesting, right? Because now, especially, and I don't want to spend too much time on this because I want to get back to the, kind of core story and some of the themes that we've outlined to talk about today. But it is interesting right now that the whole narrative around thinness is so intertwined with health. But I remember the days when the thinness narrative was, like it just like health was the least of it, right? Like it was just, it so did not, like I remember really thinking to myself, I don't care. I remember the first time I ever took cocaine, right? The first time I ever used cocaine. And I was scared. I was nervous. I was a good girl. I was a good girl. I worked hard. I wanted to get in the right college. I just want to do all the things. I was very nervous, very anxious, like most folks with eating disorder, very anxious person. I was a scaredy cat. I was not the type of girl who was going to end up doing these kinds of drugs. But I remember getting to a point where I was so desperate that I was just like, I don't care. I need to be thin. Like, I just want to be thin, right? If Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen can do this, I'm doing it too, right? Like they were the models of behavior at this point in my life.
Oh, wow. That's a scary thought.
Yeah. Yeah. We're the same age. Me and Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen are born 2 days apart. I'm
Oh,
June
wow.
15th, 1986. They're June 13th, 1986. And when I was in college, it was around the time that they were like dominating the tabloids. I don't know if you remember this period.
No, totally. I grew up with them too. Yeah. Full House, all the
Yeah,
things.
exactly. So, it was like I wanted to be an Olsen twin. Like that was like the ultimate goal at this point in my life. So very quickly ended up in treatment, and getting into treatment was really, in my opinion, kind of like the beginning of the second half of the story, because once I got into treatment, I was not treatment resistant. I was not somebody who was forced into treatment. I was a person who probably should have gotten into treatment 5 years earlier, but because I never made the weight class, because I was, never thin enough, no one ever paid attention to how much I was struggling. Right. I
Totally.
mean, I was struggling. I had such a raging eating disorder pretty much my entire like conscious memory. I was living with an active eating disorder, and no one noticed because I wasn't thin enough. No one noticed. No one knew. It was just sort of like, oh, poor girl can't get her weight under control. Like that was sort of the attitude. Um, so I remember I was excited to go to treatment. I mean, I was very scared about, I got kicked out of school. Like I incurred a lot of bad, it was not, the process of getting into treatment was really scary and really ugly. It was not a happy memory at all. Ruined relationships with my parents. I mean, it was bad news. But fundamentally, I remember once it was like clear that I couldn't go back to school, I was kicked out of school. I had to go to treatment. I was not a person who was treatment resistant. Like I was not a person who was like, oh, my parents are making me go, which happens a lot to high schoolers. I think a lot of folks with eating disorders get sent to treatment by their parents, and they're not actually necessarily super invested or interested in treatment. I was not that way. I wanted to be fixed, like I was like, I remember going into the intake interview for my treatment facility and saying, I will stop doing drugs tomorrow, because of course at that point everyone thought that I just had a drug problem. They didn't even realize that it was a food issue. And I got into the intake and I said, I will stop doing drugs tomorrow if you can teach me how to control my weight without them. That's literally what I said. I said, I will never do cocaine again if you can teach me how to stay thin without it. And
So
the intake woman's,
I
yeah,
have to
go
just
ahead.
validate that. Like I for many years worked in a treatment center and ran a weekly nutrition group, and I had people ask me that all the time. And
Yeah.
I think it's a really fascinating thing that I wish would change in the substance use disorder space, that like it's almost like we can't talk about the food side of things, or like this is, I don't know, the rhetoric around it isn't helpful for isn't always helpful for someone who doesn't identify as like, well, the whole reason I started this in the first place was
To be
the
thin.
pursuit of thinness. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so guess what? So in the intake, I was like, I will stop doing drugs tomorrow if you can teach me to be thin without it. And you know what she said to me? She said, got it. We can do that. That's what
Ah,
she said to me.
okay.
She said, yep. She said, yep, totally. Completely understand. We can do that. Because that's how clinical treatment assumes that at the end, I mean, I don't know. It's interesting. This was 15 years ago. And I think that there are a lot of amazing changes that are happening in clinical treatment. So I don't want to be like totally bashing clinical treatment. But 15 years ago, like there were the concept of health at every size was not a thing in most clinical treatment settings, right? Like 99% of clinical treatment settings, that was not a thing. And so it was assumed when you're in recovery, you will be a thin person. You will end up in this specific BMI range. Right. So people would just say that to me. People would just be like, yep. And I remember when I was in treatment, there were there were larger folks and there were thinner folks. There weren't, quite frankly, there weren't that many larger folks. The larger folks were people who are also, by and large, like, you know, well, I'm trying to think of like the few examples in my treatment, but it was, without getting into too much detail, basically the larger folks were assumed to have the types of eating disorders where they needed to be eating less, obviously, right?
Yeah.
And so they would get put on smaller meal plans, right? So it was like the thin girls in the eating disorder treatment would be getting the larger amounts of food, and the larger folks in the eating disorder treatment would be getting starvation amounts of food. Like they would be on, it was a diet program, like masquerading as an eating disorder treatment program. Anyway,
So
I won't get too much into
did
that.
you go into like addiction recovery treatment center and an eating recovery treatment center?
Yes. So it was a dual diagnostic program, which is
Okay.
pretty common in some of these like sort of like fancy rich girl rehabs, which is the one that I went to. It's the one where your parents are shelling out, or you yourself, if you're, depending on who you are, shelling out tens of thousands of dollars for a 30-day treatment program in like Southwest Arizona, like it was that kind of deal. And, there's equine therapy and, EMDR and, you're doing all this stuff. It's like a spa, but you can't leave and they drug test you. And in theory, it's like some of the best minds of, the best sort of therapists, the top of the line, this and that, right? Like I thought I was going to get the best treatment. And I guess arguably I was at that time getting the best of the best treatment. It's just that even the best of the best treatment was so problematic at that point in time. And I think probably still is for a lot of folks. I mean, I could go on and on about sort of the issues with a lot of clinical treatment programs and all of this. But yeah, when I went in, it was a dual diagnostic program. So they had a trauma program and they had a drug abuse program and they had a eating disorder track, right? And, people got put into different tracks at this fancy rehab. And then some folks were diagnosed with dual diagnosis, which basically means you're doing two tracks at the same time. For this particular program, if you were eating disorder track, that trumped substance abuse. So basically, it was acknowledged that eating disorders were, in their opinion, kind of more complicated than substance abuse. So the eating disorder track automatically was longer than the substance abuse track. You were there for a minimum of 6 weeks as opposed to a minimum of 4 weeks. And if you were if you were tracked with eating disorder and substance abuse, you basically ended up being in the eating disorder track, and then they just also kept you sober.
Gotcha. Okay.
So, and this is, to my knowledge, still how it works in a lot of places. And I think it's good, at the time it made sense to me to have, the reason I chose to go to one of these places and fork up all the money and do all of this was because in my mind, I was like, yeah, I am, dual diagnosis. Like the other option is what? To go be forced and do 30 days of sobriety and have zero eating disorder treatment and then get out. I mean, it was just, yeah. So, anyway, got out of treatment again for 6 weeks. I remember going into treatment thinking, oh my God, yes, in 6 weeks, I will be healed, right? Like in 6 weeks, my lifetime of misery with food and my weight will be over and I won't have to do drugs anymore. And they're just going to teach me how to be thin permanently. And this is my issue. I'm a binge eater. And it was like, I remember feeling like, the clouds parting when was able to diagnose, and kind of when I had this diagnosis, right, it was very validating to get the diagnosis of like, oh yeah, you have a binge eating problem or you have an eating disorder, period. And just thinking, oh yes, like I have this is why I've been struggling my whole life, and they're going to fix me in 6 weeks. Got out of treatment, did not get fixed. That was a meal plan based program, an exchange plan program, which again, various different things. I think that there are a lot of instances in which obviously intuitive eating is not appropriate right off the bat, and people need to be on sort of rehabilitative meal plans. But for this particular program, it was an exchange plan where my exchanges were being altered and modified depending on my weight. So, I remember.
And to your knowledge, like you knew?
They would tell me. We
wow.
would talk about it with my nutritionist. Yeah, for sure. It was like fully like out in the open. I mean, they didn't tell me what my weight was. They wouldn't tell me the number, but they would be like, yeah, okay, you're in the safe range now. Or like, oh yeah, you're up a little bit. And I would be like, okay, well, so then can I get my meal plan modified so that I don't gain any more weight? And they would comply. So this was just like how it was. And I remember, right, like in my mind, there was that's just, it was just like, basically I should be eating the amount of food that keeps me at the correct weight. That was sort of the attitude, is that the amount of food I should be eating is the amount of food that I should be eating correct, right, to keep me at this weight. And my exchange plan was constantly being modified to just keep me at this like magic weight. Which by the way is not my set point weight. I'm significantly heavier now than I was at this point in time. It was basically just the weight that like I no longer classified as underweight according to the random BMI charts. Right. So anyway, I get out of treatment and immediately start binging again, pretty much, right? Like immediately. I mean, when you're in treatment, everything's like controlled. Yeah, exactly. When you're in treatment, everything's controlled. I actually even did have like a couple like binges where I snuck food in rehab, and get this, I got punished in rehab for doing that. So when I was in rehab, I remember being like, I'm going to come clean to my nutritionist and like be honest about the fact that I went into the kitchen and like took an extra whatever from the kitchen last night when no one was around. And I'm going to come clean and be honest because, recovery starts with honesty, right? This was the messaging. And I got like docked points, right? Like you got like recovery points depending on how well you did the things that you were supposed to do in treatment.
And meanwhile, I remember questions about like, okay, are you starving?
Hungry? Yeah, exactly. Right. But yeah, no, exactly. So anyway, I end up, eventually I leave treatment, and it's basically I like leave treatment and I did like an aftercare. So after this initial 6 weeks, I went to like a step down program, which was the exact, the same thing with less equine therapy. But the way that the step down program was, it was like you could leave, you had more flexibility, you were more freedom. It wasn't like a lockdown situation. I got like a little job. I had like a little part-time job while I was there. It was effective, it's a halfway house effectively. And you had to go to Overeaters Anonymous meetings. And so that was when I got introduced to OA. And so then now, I'm in OA, and OA, OA is complicated. OA is, I have done entire podcast episodes just about my experiences in Overeaters Anonymous. And if anyone's interested in that, we can, I'll lead you to that if you want to get in touch with me. But, when I was in Overeaters Anonymous, right, it's basically the message is like, stick to your plan, whatever your plan is, right? If your plan is, incredibly highly restrictive, like, 1,200 calories a day, no sugar, no flour, right? This is some people's plans in a way, or these just like insanely dangerous restrictive diets, just masquerading as I need to do this because I'm a binge eater and like I have a food, but like it's just insane things. And some people's plans are significantly more lenient than that, but it's still the core concept is you have a plan. You have some sort of abstinence plan that's basically effective to your sobriety with food, and you stick to the plan. And if you go off the plan, it's like you're off the wagon and you're out of your sobriety with food. And it's like day one, it's like you got to start your day count over again. And the whole goal is to, have, you get chips. Oh, you got 90 days without going off your plan, right? I mean, a year without going off your plan, right? And this is effectively what OA is. And so you can imagine, like, this was basically, I mean, this was all just, it was like I was in treatment. I thought that I was in treatment. This was what was being told to me as the answer to binge eating disorder and eating disorders in general, was this, right? Different versions of stick to your plan no matter what. And it was, I mean, now I recognize it. I'm like, oh my God, this is just dieting with like some talk therapy in between on occasion, you know? Yeah. But it was, it's very challenging because, you're sitting there and you're just like, you want help. I was not treatment resistant. I wanted help. I was like, I'm struggling. Like I'm miserable. Like, help me, like all I wanted was somebody to take me out of my misery. Right. And this is what was being offered to me by, in theory, some of the best professionals in the United States. So again, parents spent, I think my mother spent almost $100,000 on treatment that year.
Wow.
So yeah, so crazy. So, I get out of all of these different inpatient treatments and I come back to New York and I'm like living my life in New York. Thankfully, I got really clear that I cannot screw with drugs. Like, I was just like, I am not doing drugs. Right. And thank God, by the grace of God, right? Like, I did not end up, kind of relapsing with the drugs. Like, that seemed to be like a hard line in the sand for me. And also for the most part, purging. I may or may not have had some relapses there that I don't even remember, but for the most part, like the purging and the coke really like stopped after rehab. But my whole life from getting out of rehab on for many years revolved around just going to OA meetings and just being like, just trying to stick to my meal plan no matter what. And, Overdose Anonymous and 12-step programs, they're very, they're spiritual programs. So like the message is like, basically like pray to God to stick to your diet, like get on your knees and pray for help to maintain your abstinence from whatever, food thing you're not supposed to do. Right. So it's like stick to your meal plan and like do all this spiritual work, again, all for the goal of just being able to stick to your plan.
What's that like to have your spirituality intertwined with dieting?
Oh my God. Well, it's fascinating, right? Because on the one hand, it was my first introduction to spirituality at all.
Oh, is that right?
Oh yeah. I mean, I grew up in a totally atheistic household. My mother grew up in the Catholic Church and, had a real resentment towards the Catholic Church for all the, various reasons that you can imagine. And she was kind of like a pretty staunch atheist. I mean, still is to this day. I mean, that's something that my mom and I do not share in common today because I feel like I have a deep spiritual life. But I was pretty politically atheist. I mean, growing up, I was like super secular. Like, I thought religion was, the root of a lot of evils and problems in the world. And I had a real critique, and I never had a spiritual life before getting into OA. And so it was this like really weird thing where I did have deep spiritual experiences in OA because I was like miserable on my knees talking to God, and I had moments where I had a lot of, it was confusing because I had I mean, in some ways I have to credit OA with being the beginning of my spiritual understanding of the world, which is now such a huge part of my life. I mean, huge part of my life, my spiritual life. But it is also true that at the time, what a lot of that revolved around trying to stick to my meal plan / what I would now call a diet.
Yeah, so you probably had to unlearn that element of your spirituality then, if that's how you were introduced to it, right?
I mean, I remember, thank God. I mean, I think that, getting out of OA also was a spiritual process. So it's like my spirituality was always mine. Like, it's not like I felt like, I had to leave my spirituality, right? It's not like I think some people, like I know a lot of people, one of the other various different things that I attempted my spirituality followed me and came with me on my path, wherever my path led me, which did eventually lead me out of OA. But I remember one of the other things I tried was, I don't know if you're familiar with something called the Way Down Diet, but the Way Down Diet is a church in Tennessee. It's a fundamentalist Christian church in Tennessee that basically is the intuitive eating God diet. So it's pray to God to help you not eat when you're not hungry. And they define hunger as a growl in your stomach.
Oh my.
Yes, this was another thing that I tried, right? So this is what I'm saying.
Okay.
My story actually is not interesting before I go to rehab. Before I go to rehab, it's just a common story of a diet binge cycler, like lady who's crazy around food in her body. After I go to rehab becomes the second half of the story, which is me trying all of the different recovery programs out there. All of the different, I spent years doing various different kinds of binge eating disorder recovery programs before I really, had my eventual come to Jesus moment where I really healed, which we'll talk about. But one of the things that I tried, not only OA, but eventually I decided that OA, I remember one of the things that came up is I learned about intuitive eating from another person in OA. It was, I tell the joke that it's kind of like being in prison and your friend is like, psst, psst, here, I've got some cigarettes for you. It was like, it was like, it was like you're in OA and you're kind of making friendships and no one's a lot of folks in OA that's not working for them. They're trying to figure it out. And so I had another girlfriend who also was kind of struggling and I was struggling. We were trying to work it out in OA and we were friends. And, one of the things that OA does well is create community, right? So you're kind of making friends, but neither of us were really 100. We were still trying to find the answer. And she's sort of hey, psst, I found this book by Janine Roth. I don't know if you know who Janine Roth is. I'm sure you know who Janine Roth is.
I do.
Maybe some people listening do not. So Janine Roth is, I'd call her an intuitive eating for weight loss person is what I would call her, but she is an intuitive eating person. And coming out of OA where it's super restrictive dieting, just even the concept of intuitive eating for weight loss was kind of a miracle, right?
Well, and to be fair, the intuitive eating book was a weight loss book in the first few editions.
Oh, for sure. 100%. Right.
Yeah.
It was a different time, there was no health at every size was not really health at every size existed, but it was a small fringe movement largely happening in Northern California by a bunch of basically radical queer people who were largely underground. And there was not a lot of intuitive eating and they would talk health at every size folks understood about intuitive eating, but the vast majority of intuitive eating people have never even heard of health at every size. And so, most intuitive eating at that point was weight loss focused. And so I remember she passed me the Janine Roth book and I remember reading about intuitive eating and Janine Roth. Another thing about Janine Roth, again, problematic, not a perfect. I don't recommend her work because it's not weight neutral. And I think it can be really triggering for folks, but she's an amazing memoir style writer. She's also just such a good writer, just her writing skills are amazing. And I'm reading her stories about, her experiences of, what it's really like in the trenches, but having a totally different solution. And I'm resonating. I'm yes, she understands me. I thought the people in OA understood me too, but she's telling the exact same story with a very different solution. And I'm and the OA thing hasn't been working for me. I can't get more than 30 days. I can't get more than a 30-day chip before completely binging my face off, and I get to, and I discovered Janine. So at this point, I'm kind of bouncing back and forth between intuitive eating and OA, right? It's it's got to be one of these, right? One of these has to be the magical answer to not binge eat, but in my mind, which also meant the magical answer to permanent thinness. So I was kind of bouncing back and forth between intuitive, kind of pursuing intuitive eating for weight loss, the hunger and what I call, and, eventually kind of wrote my big blog post, the hunger and fullness diet, right? That was one of my very first blog posts that I ever wrote 10 years ago was, the hunger and fullness diet. I feel that one's really followed me far into my career.
But it's such a good point because it's so easy to turn intuitive eating into that.
Oh, yeah, exactly. That's really what I was. For years when I was attempting intuitive eating, I was quote unquote unsuccessful because in my mind, it was a matter of success and failure. And success meant not eating when you weren't hungry or not eating emotionally. And success meant, failure meant eating emotionally or eating when you weren't hungry enough, right? Whatever. So I'm bouncing back and forth between the Janine Roth, like intuitive eating for weight loss, hunger and fullness diet world. And then, of course, I would fail at that, right? Because the hunger and fullness diet doesn't work either. I mean, I would binge my face off in the hunger and fullness diet because I'd be like, oh, I want something and I don't know if I'm hungry enough. And then I'm off the wagon. Oh, I might as well eat everything that isn't nailed down. And then tomorrow I'll never eat when I'm not hungry again, right? I mean,
That's such a relatable like cycle for people. That is so common.
Oh yeah. Oh yes. Oh yeah. Yeah, totally. I mean, it's almost funny. I'm like noticing that I'm taking for granted. I'm like saying this as if this is like a story that everyone is like just understands and knows about. But yeah, like that's what it was like. I remember when I first was attempting intuitive eating, that's what it was. It was the hunger and fullness diet. And so of course it did not work because if I would do something that I did not perceive was okay, like, oh, I got too full, or I ate when I wasn't hungry, or I ate emotionally or whatever, right? If I would be off the wagon, right? It would be like, oh, well, I screwed up, might as well eat everything that isn't nailed down. And then tomorrow I'm going to get back on the wagon of the hunger and fullness diet, right?
Promise yourself this is the last time.
Yeah, it was the same thing. It was the same thing. There really was no difference for me between the hunger and fullness diet and a lot of other diets that I was doing. I mean, I used to say to clients, I'd rather you be on the hunger and fullness diet than like Atkins, like I'd rather you be on the hunger and fullness diet than some of these other diets. But functionally speaking, they're all really the same and you're going to probably get the same results with all of them. I also think with the hunger and fullness diet, depending on what your definition of hunger is, you could end up really starving yourself, which is what ended up happening with this church hunger and fullness diet. So there's this, again, some people may have know about this. I mean, it's a famous program, the Way Down diet, and there's hundreds of thousands of people who are doing this. And do they
spell Way, Weigh?
Yes.
Of course they do. Okay.
Of course they do. Way Down, right? Way Down diet. And basically, they have a very limited definition of hunger. So a hunger is a growl in your stomach. Now, you and I know if your stomach is growling, you're not just hungry. You don't just have appetite. You're like super hungry. You're like an 8 or 9 on the hunger scale if you're physically growling, and they would basically be like, it's like kind of like stop at the perfect level of satiation. Like, fullness was something to be avoided. Trust me, if my stomach is growling, I'm probably going to sit down and get stuffed. Like that's probably what I'm going to need to get satisfied,
I'm the same way. That's like my stomach hardly ever growls. And it's only if it's like beyond, it's
right.
That primal place.
Exactly. So on the Way Down diet, it was quote unquote, it was basically, it was the hunger and fullness diet where you pray to God in between to like not eat when you're not hungry. Literally pray to God to keep you from like sinning of gluttony, like the sin of gluttony of eating when you're not hungry. And then hunger is defined in this way that any other normal person would define as starvation. Right. So, in that sense, in that particular instance, the hunger and fullness diet is super dangerous. I mean, I remember there were days on doing Way Down diet where I was eating calories that I would not, that a nutritionist would never wish for anyone, like that. It was not okay. But you could eat whatever you want and all foods were legal. It was like your only job was to just make sure that you were basically starving before you ate it. So I would not eat all day. I would not eat until 2 p.m. And then I'd have half a chocolate cupcake and I'd be like, I'm politely satisfied. I've got to stop. Right. And it was a disaster. I mean, it was really bad. And that would also not last, obviously. I was getting sick. That was when I started to get physically, I was getting colds all the time. My immune system was screwed up. But I was having a spiritual experience. You know what I mean? This is also gets really complicated. Yeah. So, and I remembered having deep spiritual experiences, I remember having I remember going to a Way Down conference in Ohio or something. I mean, me and a girlfriend who was also doing this flew there to go to a Way Down conference. I eventually ended up leaving because I remember thinking this is really the answer. I'm going to commit myself to God and I'm going to be thin forever. Right. Again, I was an atheist who grew up in New York City. And this is where my desire for thinness led me, right? Like, that's the level of desperation. I mean, the drugs were one thing, but like to take like, atheist New York City girl and like now I'm in Ohio with the fundamentalist Christians praying for thinness, like that was my level. And this was after rehab. Um, so
Wow.
yeah. And so then, yeah, I eventually ended up leaving because I remember just like having this moment where like, I was like, okay, but like, seriously, like how biblically literalist are we going to get? And I couldn't deal with like, I mean, the homophobia, like I had enough of a ability to be like, okay, this isn't right. Like, I can't join this church. I can't like be in this church and marry into this church and be in this church community. Like I just,
So was it all like church was all about hunger?
church, I mean, it was following the way of the Bible, right? I mean, it was a fundamentalist Christian church, but one of the tenets, right, was basically not eating when you weren't hungry. Like God put your hunger signals in you to tell you when he wanted you to eat.
So that's like one of those mortal sins kind of thing, like you
Yes,
were
it was a
saying.
mortal sin. It was a
Okay.
gluttony. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Exactly.
That's
Yes.
so much pressure. And I wonder what it would feel like to be a person of size in that congregation.
Oof. I mean, I think it was like the type of thing where you either lost weight or you left.
Right, right.
You know what I mean? But I will tell you, the people of size who had the 100-pound weight loss stories in the Way Down diet through starving themselves through the power of God were praised like you wouldn't even believe.
Yeah, I
You
bet.
know what I mean? Like like they were held up as like the ultimate testimonials of God's love.
Oh,
Like
yeah,
it
the
was
golden children of this
the
program.
golden, right? Exactly. The golden children were like the 100-pound losers. I mean, the golden children of all of these programs were the 100-pound losers. Like if you started as a plus size person and became a thin person, it was like you were a magical person to them, and they did not care that you were, your blood pressure was dropping and your vital, like they didn't care about like any of the physical or emotional or mental consequences on your health. It was just like, look at you. And I always think about that with, when I talk to folks who are 100-pound losers, whether they're in my practice or, anywhere else, is, we know 100-pound losers are they're lauded and they're praised so much because they're so rare, because it's so hard and so miserable to actually accomplish that. There's so, I often say it's like the weight loss registry or whatever. It's like, it's so unusual for somebody to maintain these kinds of like, like intense weight losses and sustain them for several years. It's so unusual that we actually have a documented list of who's accomplished that in the United States. So yeah, no, it's wild.
That is wild. So when did things start to shift for you? When did you start to kind of it sounds like
So
you tried a lot of things. Did you were trying intuitive eating from like the hunger
yeah,
fullness perspective?
right. So everything was weight loss focused. The concept of health at every size, the concept of weight set point theory did not exist. And I remember, so I actually had, so I was sort of bouncing back and forth between like, okay, it's either got to be, intuitive eating, which again, in my mind was a totally distorted hunger and fullness diet for weight loss thing, right? It's not the same kind of intuitive eating that I teach, right? I was like, it's got to be either intuitive eating or it's OA, right? Or it's like stick to your meal plan no matter what, like don't eat sugar, flour, just pray to God to not eat, blah blah blah, right? It's one of these, and so I was bouncing back and forth between these two things, basically just bouncing back and forth between one control mechanism to the next, one control mechanism to the next. It was always some sort of control. This is the thing that's gonna save me. What's the diet that's gonna save me, right? But even though it was under the umbrella of recovery, in quotes, it still functionally was the same thing that I'd always been doing. It's just like, what's the magical diet that's going to save my life? What is the thing to do that's going to save me and bring me permanent thinness and therefore like, peace and happiness and unicorns and rainbows and whatever. And so, I remember I had like a crash and burn moment in OA, like a final crash and burn moment in OA, where I was like, I was like a 4 or 5 day binge, like calling home sick from work, couldn't get out of bed, couldn't get out of the fetal position, so full, like heartburn, like like thought I was going to like, really thought that I was like going to like hurt myself, like, you know, like that, and just the anxiety and the panic and just feeling just like, I can't even, it's like the misery that I was feeling, you know, at the end of this, like, just last, I call it like my last hurrah of a binge eating episode after getting out of OA. And I was like, okay, I'm done. OA is done. We're never doing OA again. Like, I can't do this. And then I had my final intuitive eating diet, hunger and fullness diet. And that was actually the way down diet. The way down diet, I was like, it's gotta be this. I was like, it's gotta be the hunger and fullness diet. This is my last try. I mean, I literally went into it like, this is the only thing left.
Right.
And I gave it my all. And I had the most intense, same thing, just a final, just like a 4 to 5 day, just bender on food, you know, where it was just like the most intense binging I'd ever done in my entire life. And this was 3 or 4 years after I got out of rehab. The most intense, but it was just like crazy. And I was living alone in my apartment, in my like little studio apartment, just like binging for like 4 or 5 days, just miserable. And I can't even tell you. And this is where I've never heard of health at every size. I've never heard of weight set point theory. I've never heard of any of it. And I just remember, like, at this point, at least, I sort of had a hint of a spiritual, you know, life. And I just remember just like kind of getting on my knees and just being like, God, I just can't do this anymore. I just can't control my food. And that was exactly that line. It was like a message. It was like the clouds parted. And that was the line. I can't control my food. I can't control my food. Now, in the past, that was a problem, right? In the past, I can't control my food was like, what's wrong with you? Why can't you control your food? Why can't you control my food? And this was different. This was like, it was like a message like, no. You can't control, like, don't control your food. Don't try.
Like, that's the problem.
Do not try. Yeah, exactly. You are like, it was like, you're right. You can't control your food. You can't, and nothing's going to fix that for you ever. So just give up. Right? Like, that was the message. Like, give it up. Just stop. And I was so like, every time you try to muscle through, every time you try to control your food, every time you try to get control, you end up here binging your face off in the fetal position, calling home sick from work. Like that, every time you try to get control of it, you lose control in the most intense, painful way that you can imagine. You can't do it. And it didn't matter to me what the statistics were. I'd never heard about health at every size. I'd never heard of weight supplement theory. I didn't understand. I didn't know any of that. It was like literally the clouds parted and a messenger came to me and was like, you just can't. You are not capable of controlling your food and you never will be.
And that's a good thing, right? Like,
right.
Like, what a liberating moment to be like that's okay, you know?
Well, and it was like, for me, it wasn't even, I mean, I guess I had the moment of like, it's okay. I don't even know if I called it okay. You know, it was more just like, it just is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it was like a big thing we talk about in my masterclass, a big thing we talk about in my, like, you know, program is the difference between liking or loving or thinking of something as good or bad,
mm-hmm.
and just accepting it.
Right.
Like, it wasn't even like, oh, it's okay. Like, you're good. Like, it was more just like, it just is what it is. Like, you can accept it or not accept it, but like, it is, this is just the reality of the situation. Like, the sky is blue. Like, I don't have to like that the sky is blue. I don't have to have a positive judgment about the sky being blue. It's just blue. Like,
sure.
Like it or not, it is blue. Right. And it was like it was like, that was the moment. It was like, it just doesn't matter whether or not you think it's good or bad that you can't control your food. Like, it just is the way it is. Like, this is just what it is. Accept it or not accept it. Like, make room for that reality in your life or not. But whether you can resist it, but it's not going to make it untrue, right? Resisting that reality doesn't make it untrue, right? Deluding yourself into thinking the next diet is going to work doesn't make it work, right? And so, I remember, so I just remember thinking like, that was when I realized I was controlling my food it's just not an option anymore. Like, I'm just not capable of it. Like, maybe other people are capable of it, but I'm not. I'm just not. I can't do it. I've been trying for 20 years and I just can't do it. Like, I can't do it. And when I try, all hell breaks loose. It's not worth it. And I remember having the moment of like, I don't care if I gain 5 pounds, 50 pounds, 500 pounds. I can't do this anymore. Like, that's how miserable I was, right? Like, it was a moment of like, wait, that was the moment where I realized that, and don't get me wrong, I had tons of body image stuff to work through after this moment, but I had a deep moment of clarity that if I gained weight, I gained weight. I just couldn't do it anymore. I just couldn't diet anymore.
Yeah.
I just couldn't control it anymore. And it was like, that's just the way it is.
So, yeah, so it sounds like that was that, would you call that like a turning point moment of like just surrendering?
It was the turning point moment.
Yeah.
It was the turning point moment. I mean, I learned so much thereafter. You could call it like the third part. Like, if you like wanted to put like my story into 3 stages, it would be like pre-rehab, then like rehab up until this moment, and then this moment onwards. And that's when like everything fell into place, right? Like, after this was the turning point moment, and then everything fell into place after that. I mean, it was shortly thereafter that I eventually learned about health at every size and weight set point theory. And I was also having just like all of my own realizations and all of it. I mean, various validating information, just like, it was like started coming to me once I had this moment. But this moment was it was more important than learning about health at every size. This moment was more important than any other thing that I ever read in a book, because this moment, and this is getting back to what we really wanted to talk about on this podcast, this moment was not intellectual, right? Like, this moment was not about like reading about what I should do. This moment was a deeply spiritual, deeply emotional moment where I felt in the core of myself that I could not diet ever again.
Yeah. If anyone could have figured out dieting or control with this, it would have been you, given the fact that you were like a pro at it, right?
Oh yeah. I'm flying to Ohio to go to Christian weight loss summits, right? As an atheist from New York City, right?
Yeah.
Like, this is my, right? Like, really, I tried it all, Like,
yeah, totally.
And I was only getting, and in reality, I talk about this with my clients all the time. Like, you get worse at dieting over time, not better.
Yep, you do.
Dieting gets harder over time, not better. So it was like, in my opinion, it was like, I learned so much validating information, not just health at every size, not just intuitive eating. I mean, there have been so many people who have influenced me on my journey in my coaching career. I mean, so many different mentors and professionals. I mean, the amount of knowledge I have about my head in this stuff actually at this point almost bores me to tears. But none of it was as important as this moment. All of it just supported me staying in this moment and validated me staying in this place. Because the truth is there, I did have points where that moment passed. I forgot.
Yeah.
And I think that that's also something that's important to talk about, right? Like, another big thing that I talk about in my programs is, recovery is not an achievement. It's not a place that I get to and then I'm done, right? Recovery is a state of mind. It's a connection with myself, with source, with a truth, right? It's a state of mind that I can enter into or out of, right? I can be surrendered and I can fall back into control brain, right? And the game of recovery in many ways is remembering to surrender over and over and over and over again, and getting better at staying in that truth, staying connected to that reality, staying in surrender, right? Like, that is, and being able to stay there for longer periods of time in between moments where you just want to get a grip on your food again.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, so you had this transformative experience yourself. I know this is not the best language to use, but like, how do you make that happen for someone else? Like,
Ooh, I mean,
You can't, right?
first of all, I'm just going to go ahead, and this might sound arrogant, but I'm going to just go ahead and say, even in this conversation, I bet there's someone listening to this who's like, wow, I feel that in my body as she's talking about it.
Oh, yeah, for
Right.
sure.
I mean, right. So it's like, if I can create, so it's like my coaching programs are all about, kind of immersing yourself in these kinds of conversations where it's not just like intellectual information, but like you're really feeling what I'm talking about. And creating, it's like language is not the answer, but language can point us to emotional experiences that can change us deeply forever.
Sure.
You know,
And it's got to
you know,
come from you this has to be your idea. That this has to be something you feel.
yes. Well, and it's interesting, the concept of your idea. It's like it could be somebody else's idea, but as long as you feel it,
It's got to feel like your own, I guess is what I'm
it's
trying to
right.
say.
It's you've got to feel it in your body. You have to feel it, not just think it. Right? And this is the big concept, right? Right? Maybe something I say, you feel something for a second even, right? But that is right. Recovery is right. It's a state of being. You do have to feel it. Just thinking it isn't enough.
So you talked about like this moment of surrender and this feeling of surrender and how recovery is sort of
Yeah.
getting better at being in that place longer and at pulling yourself
Mm-hmm.
back into that place when you recognize that you are kind of veering off toward more control or more manipulation or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that look like on a practical level?
Well, which part of it? Let's define practical. Like, give me an example.
I just mean, what does that look like on a day-to-day basis of pulling yourself back into that place of surrender? So do you want me to like make up a
Like
story or
noticing. Well, yeah. I mean, so like on a day to day basis, I mean, I think so. One of the practices is just noticing when you're getting back into control mode, right? Okay. So, like, let's just back up for a second because I didn't really fully describe this, but there's sort of two states of being, right? There's the sort of recovered, surrendered state, which really, like, when we talk about a surrendered state, what that really means is like a full relaxation of the body. Like, right? Like, I can't do it. I give up. I give up. I don't give a hoot what my food, like, I don't have the energy to care about what my food looks like. I don't have the energy to care about this anymore. I give up, right? When we talk about this concept of surrender, this concept of I give up, right? It's a release. It's a release. It's a relaxation. It's a letting go, right? Like, this is what people talk about when they say letting go around food. It's I just can't anymore. Who cares, right? Like, if I gain weight, fine. If I eat the thing, fine. If I eat 10 of the things, fine. I don't have the energy to care about this anymore. I give up. I give up, right? That state that I described, that I experienced, that very first time that I experienced it, it was a release. It was a relief. It was a relaxation of my body. If I was hooked up to like electrodes, I'm sure it would show on a computer that every muscle in my body just relaxed in that moment. Right. And this is really important language to understand, because I think something that people forget is that eating disorders are fundamentally, at the end of the day, they are anxiety disorders. They are anxiety disorders. They are control disorders. They are effectively OCD around food. When you are in diet mode, basically you are living chronically in a state of tension and stress around food, right? Like, food is a landmine, that it's going to kill me and I've got to be careful. I can't eat that. I can't eat this. Okay, make sure that I don't, if I eat too much of that, then this is going to happen. Then all hell will break loose. And oh my gosh, if I have the brownie, then I might eat 10 brownies and I can't trust myself, right? That's what an eating disorder is. That's what disordered eating is. It is constant tension and stress. It is, I have Gwyneth Olwyn, who I respect very much, who is not in the intuitive eating world, but she's an eating disorder researcher who has influenced me significantly. She calls, her definition of an eating disorder is the misidentification of food as a threat. The misidentification of food as a threat, right? Like, it's going to come and get me in the night, right? Like, oh
Yeah.
my God, if I eat the wrong thing, no one's going to love me. All hell's going to break loose, right? If I gain weight, no one's going to love me. All hell's going to break loose. It's an anxiety disorder. That's fundamentally what it is, right? And I learned this deeply well after I stopped dieting, because guess what? After I stopped dieting, that anxiety just started attaching to other things. I never identified as an anxious person when I was in my eating disorder, because I didn't even realize I was anxious, because I was just obsessed with food all the time. I just thought food was the issue. When I stopped dieting, that's when I realized how anxious I really was. Because when I really let go and when I really stopped dieting, that anxiety started coming out and it started attaching to other stuff, right? All of a sudden, it was like I was really concerned about money. All of a sudden, I was really concerned about dating. All of a sudden, I was really concerned about all these other things. Now, some people have food issues and know that they're anxious, and they identify that this anxiety can come out in a lot of different areas. But a lot of folks with eating disorders don't even realize that they're anxious, because they're just so obsessed with food the whole time that they can't even think, right? Like, they don't have even the perspective to see that actually fundamentally this is an anxiety issue.
Yeah.
Right.
So really quick, while
yeah.
you were talking about the importance of language and
Yes.
making sure we're on the same page. So when you
Yes.
say like, I give up, I imagine that people have a reaction to that. Is there anything you want to speak to as far as like the nuance of that and what that really means?
There's two reactions to that. There's only two reactions to that. One is deep relief and the other is terror. Right? I mean, those are the two reactions that anyone listening to this who's struggling with food is going to have when they hear I give up. Deep relief or terror. Right? They're either like being like at the, right? If you're at the place where you're like, you know what? The pain of this eating disorder is so great that I don't care. Right? Like,
Yeah.
I can resonate with this idea of like the pain of being obsessed with food is more than I'm more afraid of continuing to live my life so obsessed with food than I am of just eating the things or eating 10 of the things or get the weight gain or whatever, right? You get to a point where the pain of staying where you are is greater than the fear of the unknown. Right. It's like that Anais Nin quote, right? You get to the point where the pain of the staying in the bud is greater than the fear of blooming. Right. And so if you're ready for that, when you hear the statement, you know what, I give up, screw it, I don't care. If I eat all the things, if I gain, who cares? I just don't have the energy to worry about this anymore. I don't have the energy to be obsessed and crazy about this anymore. I don't care. I give up. If you're ready for that, it's going to feel like deep relief.
Yeah.
Right?
I guess
if you're not, you're going to feel terrified.
I guess where I was coming from was just being clear about what you're giving up. Like, you're giving up control, giving up, right?
Yeah. Like
because I think there could be some question.
Giving up on trying to make your food look a certain way, giving up on trying to make your body look a certain way.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what I wanted to clarify was just like, what are we giving up? Like, because I think, you know, this is super nuanced and maybe not where people need to think when you're new to this process of letting go. But I also think that there's space for continuing to nurture and care for yourself, even when you've given up the idea of control with food, right? Like, you can still, I mean, and maybe I differ in my opinion toward this versus you, but I think that when people perceive giving up as like, I can't allow myself to like connect to my body and nurture myself in a way that feels good to me, then all of a sudden sometimes recovery can feel like not worth it. I don't know if I'm communicating well, but are you hearing what I'm saying?
I think that this is a really common question, right? And it's sort of like it is a subtle, nuanced definition of what I give up is, right? Like, you know, like, I eat really healthy, nutritious foods, but like, it's not a try. It's not like I gotta do it.
Yeah.
It just happens. It's natural. Right. So this is another really important thing about like the concept of no control. In our culture, we think letting go of control means all hell's going to break loose.
Right. That's exactly right.
We live in a culture where we think if I am not controlling everything, the worst possible outcome will happen. If I don't control my food, I will just eat donuts all day long. That is the assumption in our culture, which
Right.
is obsessed with control. That's why everyone is depressed and anxious all the time. It's because we live in a culture that's obsessed with control. This is not the case in all cultures, right? This is a relatively new idea in like, I would say the last 500 years since the age of enlightenment and, meritocracy and blah, blah, blah. But like certainly, especially in like modern Western culture, and I would say even America as a front runner, control, right? We are obsessed with the concept of like, you determine your fate. You muscle your way into your fate, right? It is sink or swim. You've got to do it. Every good thing that happens to you, you did it. And every bad thing that happens to you is your fault, right? That's the culture that we live in. That's how we are all raised. We are all come into this life. If you grew up in America, certainly, and most of the modern world, right? You probably grew up with that assumption. And now we're leaning into this other possibility, which is if I don't, the truth is like, I really don't control much, and good stuff happens to me all the time. Right? Amazing. The most miraculous things that have ever happened to me in my life were a total swing of fate. Right?
Yeah. No, I love that. Thanks for diving into that a little bit. Just to help people understand what you mean when you say that.
Right. Not controlling, again, not controlling. And again, it's a little bit nuanced because I think when we initially let go of disordered eating patterns, you're probably going to eat a lot. And you're probably going to eat a lot of foods that were previously illegal. And, and that's healthy. That's natural. That's rebalancing. Right. But that's a good thing. Right. Trust that. Like allow that to happen. But fundamentally, right, like there is going, in the context of full surrender around food, like it is also inevitable that one day you're going to be like, you know what, I'm really in the mood for a Chinese chicken salad.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like that's, it's not, I eat, largely very nutritious, foods on a regular basis. I have a very healthful lifestyle and I am not controlling it at all.
Yeah, I can vouch for that
too. It's just happening to me. It's like what's coming to me through the flow of life.
So what would you tell someone who says, I understand this all intellectually, but I struggle on the practical side? Like, and we could translate that into, this all sounds nice. I want to surrender. I want to connect to my body. I want to eat all the foods and not restrict myself, but I'm so freaking scared of gaining weight. What do you say?
Yeah. So this kind of is going back to what we were talking about before in terms of like, there's two things that you might experience when you hear the phrase, I give up, right? Like I give up, like I just can't do it anymore. I can't control this. I can't muscle my way into eating a certain way, right? Like I just can't, like I surrender, I let go. Whatever my food's going to be. It is what it is. There's two reactions you might have to that. If you're a person who's actively struggling with food right now, there's just probably two reactions. One is going to be deep relief that maybe you'll completely forget about after this phone call, but at least you can hear it now, you can feel it now, right? And then it's your job to just go continue to do things that help you remember it, right? Like go check out my website, for instance. But then there's another reaction that you might have, which is total and utter terror, right? Which is like, let go. What are you like that? I can't let go. I can't let go. Like the fear of weight gain, right? The terror associated with weight gain is so great right now that it's like, I just can't, like, there's no letting go, right? Like, it's so intense. I can't do, right? Like that. It's just too scary.
Socially, like status, all that stuff, right?
And I want to be clear, even if you're in the camp that can feel the relief, even if you're in the camp who can feel the relief, that doesn't mean you don't also feel the fear. It just means that there's a part of you that wants recovery a little bit more, like a hair more, like a pinky more. You want relief and peace and freedom, a pinky more than you want, like, to be thin at all costs. Right? And so I just want to be clear, right? Like, even if you do feel that relief and even if you do kind of sort of understand what I'm saying a little bit, that doesn't mean that you still don't have body image issues. It doesn't mean that you still don't have stuff to work through. I mean, I was working through stuff for years after this point. And again, that's like half my program is about what to do after you get to this point. Like, I mean, literally half my program, it's like the midway point is the surrender moment. And then we talk about all the things that we do after we start to understand the concept of surrender. And so, but if you're in the camp where you hear surrender and it's just like terror, it's interesting because there's sort of, there's a few different ways that I could answer that, right? There's a few different ways that we work with that. Cause it's sort of like, you're just in a different stage, basically, right? You're in like a different part of your journey. It doesn't mean you can't get to recovery. It just means we're just like in a different, right? There's sort of, I think recovery has phases, right? Like it has its natural like course. And for folks who are just like super, 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 super terrified, it's like one thing that I would recommend is just really, really start to take stock of what staying obsessed with food and what staying in the bud is really costing you, right? Like really starting to just take inventory of this assumption that, I'd rather, like, would you really rather stay in the bud, stay in the eating disorder than, risk the possibility of some weight gain, right? Like, just start to explore that. Like, the answer doesn't have to be yes or no. Like, we're not prodding for any particular answer. You're not right or wrong or farther away or, that from recovery or whatever, pending your answer. But it's like really just starting to take honest inventory of the quality of your life, staying in the bud. Right? Does this make sense? This concept I referenced this metaphor earlier of in the bud, right? So that's just something that I would just suggest as like one thing you can do, just like a simple, like quote unquote, practical thing you can do right away. Just start taking inventory of what's it costing you to control your weight at all costs. What is that really costing you? And sometimes this is difficult. It's an interesting inquiry because this can be easy for folks, or it can be obvious. I won't say easy, but it can be obvious for folks or not obvious for folks, pending how long they've been dealing with disordered eating. I mean, I have a lot of clients who, they've been so eating disordered for so long that it's like they can't even imagine. It's like hard to say what it's costing them because they can't even imagine life on the other side, right? It's like to say like, oh, it's costing me having healthy, happy relationships. It's like they can't even imagine having happy, healthy relationships. It almost seems like such a pipe dream, right? So it's an interesting inquiry. And again, I won't even say like, this is not a leading question. I'm not trying to get you anywhere. I'm just trying to get you to start thinking about it for yourself, like really just starting to look at that. Yeah. And then, another thing is, and this sort of goes back to the concept of eating disorders are anxiety disorders. Fundamentally, they are anxiety disorders, right? So if, and again, it's a phobia of fatness, right? Like what we're talking about is my fear of fatness, my phobia of fatness is so intense, right? That is an anxiety issue, right? We don't talk about it in these terms, especially the term fat phobia, right? It's so, like rooted in the justice world right now that we kind of just think about it as this political term. But it's also a mental health term, right? Fat phobia, right? It is a phobia. It is an anxiety disorder, right? And so if you can start to incorporate things into your life that literally relax your nervous system, physiologically relax your nervous system, and start to do things that can help you manage just generalized anxiety in your life and body, that actually will start to help you relax your phobia.
I love
right?
that.
So like, yeah. So things like, I practice Vedic meditation twice a day. And, for me, it's very, very important for helping me relax my nervous system, right? Because my nervous, I don't know what happened in my childhood, what happened in my birth plan, what happened in my genetics. I don't know what happened. I have some ideas. Don't get me wrong. I'm inquiring into this too, but something happened and my nervous system from a young age got jacked up. Right? Like I was from a super young age, jacked up nervous system, neurotic, anxious person. I was primed for eating disorder life. Right. And so I spend an enormous amount of time now as an adult. And I believe that I always will tending to my nervous system, right? Managing my nervous system, learning to relax, basically. Right. And so that is something that has nothing to do with food or weight. But if I am able to relax my nervous system, like I bet you're a lot less afraid of fatness when you're like super, just in a relaxed state. There is a connection between my fear of anything and just the physiology of my fear in my body at any given moment.
Right.
Everything is
and it
right.
helps you understand yourself and the problem or
Right.
the issue at hand better when you're able to be in that more relaxed state rather than, I
Right.
mean, when you're in fight or flight, you can't make reasonable decisions or
Exactly.
use your brain adequately, right?
Exactly. So that, I mean, again, there's more to this conversation. And if somebody's like really interested in the work that I do, again, go to stopfightingfood.com, watch my video training series, and get into my masterclass. I mean, we talk about this stuff all day, but fundamentally, I think those are the two like quippy podcast things that I can say.
Sure.
Right. It's like, these are big things. And I mean, one of the, we spend a fair amount of the masterclass just talking about like anxiety management tools, So, it's an important one too.
No, I love it. And it's just such a common thing that comes up with my clients and group members is, okay, this makes sense and I know what I need to do, but I just can't do it. And there's barriers in the way that I think are some of the things that we've talked about today, but just that disconnect between like the head and the body. Or the intellectual versus the spiritual or whatever like binary or spectrum you want to make it. I think your point is, if I could sort of summarize, is there's got to be something on the like feeling it in your body level to take it from I know this on paper, I'm reading the books, I'm listening to the podcast, to this is something that like feels right to me in my body.
Right. And I could even go so far as to say like in my nervous system, like when you're in that state of recovery, as I referenced earlier, right? Like the state of recovery, in that state, my nervous system is significantly more relaxed. Like it's
yeah.
That's why they call it freedom. That's why they call it peace. That's why they call it food freedom, right? Like that's what it's a relaxation.
Yeah,
it's a liberation.
Oh, I've loved what you've had to say today. Is there anything else that you haven't gotten to that you wanted to make sure to mention, other than, I mean, you've mentioned how to find you, but just topic wise or content wise?
Yeah, no. I mean, I think that this was a great conversation. I'm really excited to share it with my folks too. And I had a great time today, and I just, I mean, I guess I'll just repeat if you're ready to sign off, I'll just repeat again, if anyone's interested in learning more about, the work that I do, which is its own little special brand of, helping women stop feeling crazy around food, please do. Check out my website or my video training series. And, ultimately the real magic happens in the Stop Fighting Food Masterclass, which anyone who's taken the masterclass, if anyone here knows people who've been in the masterclass, will tell you, there's a lot of, it's a dope program.
Awesome. So it's stopfightingfood.com, right?
Yeah, stopfightingfood.com. And then there's like a little like free, like 3 intro videos that just sort of are like an introduction to the work. And then once you're into the video training series, like under the video training series, there's instructions for how to get into the masterclass, which is my group coaching program, that we go into all of this in quite a bit of depth. It is a super comprehensive program that thankfully I've gotten to a place where I can offer it at a like pretty affordable cost. So it's awesome. Like it's really great.
Well, thanks for being so willing to share so much of your story and what you've been through and what you've tried and your feelings of, moments of triumph, but also the times where you felt really low. Like I'm sure so many people listening can relate and just draw a lot of strength from you being able to share that. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me and giving me an opportunity to talk about all this stuff that I love so much. So thank you. Thank you.
Well, I sincerely hope you've enjoyed this conversation. If you haven't already, please go ahead and leave a review on iTunes. Thanks again so much for listening, and we'll see you soon for another episode.